The scent of centuries clung to Ilara Vance's fingertips, a dry, sweet perfume of decaying paper, leather, and forgotten ink. At 23, her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this climate-controlled archive, a hushed sanctuary of steel shelves and acid-free boxes within the formidable Thorn Foundation. She ran a delicate finger over the illuminated capital of a 15th-century manuscript, the gold leaf still shimmering under the directed lamplight. It was a letter A gateway to a story of chivalry and impossible love. Her own story felt like an unwritten page, a life held in stasis. She was an art historian by soul, but an archivist by necessity, a silent guardian of other people's histories, because hers had not yet begun. This quiet room was both her refuge and her cage, a place where time stood still, mirroring the arrested development of her own heart. If you want to discover the moment this silence is irrevocably broken by a man made of power and secrets, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. This life in New York City, a universe of cold steel and colder ambitions, was not a dream she had chased, but a cage she had willingly entered. Back in the sleepy, forgotten town she called home, her mother's illness was a quiet, relentless thief, stealing not just health and money, but also Ilara's future. The mounting medical bills were a suffocating tide, and this job, with its meager salary, was the only lifeline she could grasp. Each paycheck was a breath of air, but never enough to truly surface. She had traded rolling hills and the familiar comfort of her small world for the predatory energy of a metropolis that barely registered her existence. She was a ghost here, haunting the periphery of a life she could see but never touch, motivated by a desperate filial love that demanded everything from her. Her virginity was not a statement or a sacred vow, but a quiet consequence of this deferred life. It was a room in her soul she had never opened, the key misplaced somewhere between hospital visits and overdue notices. At an age when others collected experiences and lovers, Ilara collected worries. Her heart remained an untouched artifact, preserved by a deep-seated, almost naive belief in a love that could transcend circumstance, a grand, sweeping romance she only ever encountered in the vellum pages she so carefully handled. This untouched part of her was her symbol of all the things she had put aside, her own desires, her own journey, her own voice. It was the purest, most vulnerable piece of herself, a testament to a life lived entirely for someone else, leaving no space for her own becoming. There were moments, however, fleeting and precious, when the true Ilara surfaced. It happened when she was alone with a piece of history that spoke to her. Today it was a series of sketches in the margins of a Florentine prayer book, a tiny, defiant dragon, curled around a vine. A smile, genuine and radiant, bloomed on her face. For a few seconds, she wasn't a daughter burdened by debt or an invisible archivist. She was a scholar, a dreamer, connected across 500 years to an anonymous artist who had also found beauty in the small details. In these moments her posture would straighten, her eyes would gleam with intellectual fire, and the oppressive weight on her shoulders would momentarily lift. It was a glimpse of the woman she was meant to be, a painful reminder of the vibrant life trapped within her quiet shell. The Thorn Foundation Tower was a monument to a world she did not understand. It pierced the New York skyline like a shard of ice, all polished granite, reflective glass, and hushed, intimidating corridors. The air inside hummed with a low thrum of power and ambition, a stark contrast to the gentle silence of her subterranean archive. When she walked through the lobby, her simple coat and worn satchel felt like a confession of her otherness. She was a relic herself, something soft and organic in a sterile, inorganic world. The employees who strode past her with sharp suits and sharper expressions moved with a purpose she couldn't fathom. They were predators and players in a game whose rules she would never learn, making her feel even smaller, even more breakable. The anxiety was a constant companion, a cold knot tightening in her stomach with every email notification and every thought of home. During her lunch break, which she often took at her desk to save money, she would pull out her phone, her thumb hovering over her banking app. The ritual was a form of self-torture. Seeing the number, always too small, always dwindling too fast, sent a familiar chill through her body. It was the number that dictated every choice she made. It decided what she ate, whether she could afford a new pair of shoes when her old ones wore through, and most importantly, whether her mother would get the care she desperately needed. This crushing financial weight was the invisible force shaping her reality, bending her will until she felt she might snap. As dusk painted the city in hues of lavender and bruised purple, Ilara often stood by the thick, soundproof windows of a deserted hallway on an upper floor, looking down at the river of lights below. Taxis streaked by like golden comets, and in the windows of other buildings she could see the silhouettes of people living their lives, laughing, arguing, loving. From this height she was utterly invisible, a silent observer of a world she didn't belong to. A profound loneliness would wash over her, a deep, aching yearning to be seen, to be truly witnessed by someone for who she was, not for what she could provide. She longed for a single moment of genuine connection, a collision of worlds that would make her feel real, unaware that such a collision was careening toward her with the force of a destiny she could never have imagined. Her apartment was a shoebox in Queens, a fourth-floor walk-up where the city's symphony was a perpetual chorus of distant sirens and the neighbors' arguments through paper-thin walls. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and her landlord's curry, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled silence of the archives. A single, grimy window offered a view of a brick wall, a constant, dull red reminder of her confinement. Every piece of furniture was second-hand, a ghost of someone else's life, bearing the nicks and scratches of histories she would never know. This tiny space, which should have been her sanctuary from the city's overwhelming scale, felt more like a cell. It was the physical manifestation of her life, small, constrained, and offering no vista of the future she had once so vividly imagined for herself. The daily commute was a lesson in anonymity, a descent into the roaring, metallic belly of the city. Pressed against strangers in the crowded subway car, Ilara would make herself as small as possible, her worn satchel clutched to her chest like a shield. She was just another face in the river of humanity, her individual hopes and fears dissolved into the collective, indifferent rush. The screech of the train's wheels against the tracks felt like a physical sound inside her skull, a metallic scream that mirrored her own silent anxieties. She would watch the other passengers, seeing fragments of lives, a shared smile, a whispered secret, a hand resting on another's, and feel a profound aching loneliness. She was moving through the city's veins, but was not a part of its lifeblood, a ghost on a journey between two places where she never truly felt she belonged. Every evening, at precisely 7 o'clock, she would call home. The ritual was a carefully constructed performance of reassurance. She would sit on the edge of her lumpy mattress, force a bright, cheerful tone into her voice, and paint a vibrant picture of a life that did not exist. She spoke of interesting colleagues and exciting projects, editing out the crushing solitude and the gnawing fear. On the other end of the line, her mother would do the same, her voice, made frail by illness, insisting she was feeling stronger, that the new medication was working wonders. They were two actors in a play of mutual deception, each trying to protect the other from the brutal truth. The love between them was the foundation of this charade, but it was also the source of the immense, suffocating pressure that was slowly erasing Ilara's sense of self. Her mother's words, though gentle, carried the weight of a different era's expectations. "Have you met anyone nice, dear?" she would ask, her voice laced with a hopeful quaver. In her mother's small-town worldview, a good marriage was the ultimate security, a safe harbor for a woman adrift. She envisioned a kind, stable man who would lift their burdens, not understanding that in Ilara's world, such men seemed to belong to a different species. This gentle prodding felt like a quiet judgment on Ilara's choices, a dismissal of the career she was trying to build. The suggestion that she should find a husband to solve their problems only deepened her sense of failure. It wasn't a romantic prospect. It was presented as a transaction, an escape route she felt she had neither the right nor the means to pursue. After the call, the performance would end, and the grim reality would reassert itself. She would open her laptop, the screen's cold blue light illuminating her face in the darkroom. Her online banking portal was a landscape of dread. The medical invoices from the hospital were relentless, each one a digital paper cut to her soul. She would meticulously transfer the bulk of her paycheck, watching the meager number in her own account shrink to almost nothing. It was a silent, weekly hemorrhage. This ritual was not just about managing finances, it was a confrontation with her own powerlessness. The cold, hard numbers on the screen were the invisible bars of her cage, dictating every choice, extinguishing every small desire before it could even fully form into a wish. The ensuing silence of her evenings was a heavy blanket. She would eat a simple meal of pasta or soup while standing at the kitchen counter, the city's vibrant, chaotic energy, a distant, mocking hum outside her window. She had no friends in this sprawling metropolis. The long hours and the tight budget formed a wall around her, making social overtures feel like an impossible luxury. Her colleagues at the foundation moved in a different orbit of gallery openings and expensive dinners, their casual chatter a language from a world she couldn't access. The loneliness was a physical presence, an ache in her chest that grew sharper in the quiet hours after dark. She was surrounded by millions of people, yet she had never felt more profoundly, terrifyingly alone. On a small, dusty shelf above her bed sat her old art history textbooks. Sometimes late at night she would take one down, the weight of it familiar and comforting in her hands. She would trace the glossy reproductions of Florentine frescoes and Venetian masterpieces, the colors still vibrant, the passion of the artists palpable even on the printed page. This was the world she was meant to inhabit, a world of beauty, intellect, and historical intrigue. The dream of studying in Italy, of walking the same streets as Michelangelo and Donatello, now felt like a cruel joke, a memory from a life that belonged to someone else. The chasm between that dream and her current reality was a source of a deep, quiet grief for the woman she was supposed to become. The pressure was amplified by a weekly call from her older sister, Claire, who had married her high school sweetheart and settled into a life of comfortable domesticity back home. Claire's concern was always edged with a subtle, cutting judgment. "I just worry about you, Ilara," she'd say, her voice dripping with pity. "All alone in that big city. Maybe it's time to think about coming home. Mom needs you here." The implication was clear. Ilara's ambition was a selfish folly, her sacrifice a failure. Claire couldn't see the silent heroism in Ilara's struggle. She only saw a deviation from the expected path. Each call left Ilara feeling smaller, her resolve chipped away, the walls of her prison seeming to close in just a little bit more. Even within the hallowed halls of the Thorn Foundation, she was constantly reminded of her otherness. It was in the small, almost imperceptible slights, the way a senior curator's eyes would flick dismissively over her simple department store dress, or the faint, condescending smile she received when she unwrapped her homemade sandwich in the staff lounge. These were not acts of overt cruelty, but they were 1,000 tiny cuts that reinforced her status as an outsider. She was a service worker in a palace of intellect and old money, necessary but invisible cog in a machine whose grand design she was not privy to. In response, she perfected the art of invisibility, keeping her head down and her voice quiet, hoping not to draw the kind of attention that would expose just how fragile her position truly was. Some nights, she would forgo the subway and walk part of the way home, stopping on the bridge that overlooked the river. The city skyline glittered before her, a breathtaking testament to human ambition and power. In that vast sparkling panorama, the Thorn Tower stood tallest, a black needle piercing the heavens, a symbol of the immense, impersonal force that governed her existence. It was both her tormentor and her savior. As she stared at its distant, unblinking lights, a desperate, formless yearning would rise within her. It was a plea for something to break, for the universe to shift on its axis, for a single, cataclysmic event that would shatter the suffocating stillness of her life. She was praying for a storm, unaware that she was standing directly in its path. He was a myth, a whisper in the hallowed corridors of the Foundation, Julian Thorn. The name itself carried the weight of old money and new, ruthless power. He was a phantom who ran his global empire from a glass fortress at the apex of the tower, a place Ilara couldn't even imagine. Legends trailed him like a shadow, a tragic family history that had left him orphaned and emotionally desolate, a brilliant mind that saw the world as a series of transactions and a heart encased in ice. He was known to be surgically precise in business and utterly detached in his personal life, a man who had inherited a kingdom but lived like a ghost within its walls. His presence was an atmospheric pressure change, a drop in temperature that everyone felt but no one spoke of, a silence that was louder than any command. The day her world collided with his began with the screech of a stalled subway car, a cascade of dominoes that made her disastrously late. Clutching a portfolio of priceless 16th-century botanical illustrations, her heart hammered against her ribs in a frantic rhythm of panic. These were not mere documents. They were fragile survivors of time, and their delivery to the senior curator was her most important task to date. Rushing through the main lobby, her worn boots slipping on the polished marble, she felt the familiar sting of her own inadequacy. She was a trespasser here, a girl of paper and dust in a world of granite and steel. She bypassed the main elevators, heading for the private service lift she was granted access to, her mind singularly focused on mitigating the damage of her tardiness, unaware she was running toward the very epicenter of the power she so feared. The impact was not a crash, but a sudden, unyielding stop. It was like running into a wall that felt impossibly solid and was wrapped in the softest, darkest cashmere she had ever imagined. The portfolio flew from her grasp. Time seemed to warp, stretching into a horrifying, slow-motion ballet of disaster. The priceless vellum sheets, each a delicate masterpiece of ink and artistry, scattered across the floor like a flock of wounded birds. They slid across the gleaming marble, one coming to rest perilously close to the polished toe of a handmade leather shoe. A collective gasp echoed from the few onlookers in the private lobby, but Ilara heard nothing but the frantic, silent scream in her own mind. The world shrank. To this single catastrophic moment of her own making, a perfect crystallization of her deepest fears of failure and exposure. She looked up from the ruin at her feet and into the face of the man she had collided with. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. He simply stood there, an immovable object of quiet authority. He was tall, with a lean, powerful build that his tailored suit did little to conceal. His face was a study in harsh, beautiful angles, a strong jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth that looked as if it had never formed a genuine smile, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter storm, a deep, turbulent gray, and they held no discernible emotion, not anger, not annoyance, just a chilling, analytical stillness. It was the face of a man who observed the world from a great, unbridgeable distance, and in that moment, Ilara knew with a sickening certainty that this was him. This was Julian Thorne. Words, frantic and breathless, tumbled from her lips. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I was late. The train. I wasn't looking. The illustrations, are they damaged? Oh God, please don't let them be damaged." Her apology was a raw, unfiltered torrent of genuine distress. She immediately dropped to her knees, her hands hovering uselessly over the scattered pages, too terrified to touch them and risk causing more harm. Her cheeks burned with a shame so profound it felt like a physical fever. This wasn't a calculated plea to save her job. It was the mortified cry of a historian who had just desecrated a sacred text. In that moment she forgot who he was, forgot where she was, consumed entirely by the sacrilege she had committed against the history she cherished more than herself. Julian watched her, his expression unchanging, but inside him something shifted. A tectonic plate, frozen for over a decade, ground into motion. He was accustomed to fear, to sycophancy, to the carefully constructed masks people wore in his presence. He had never encountered this. Her panic was utterly authentic, her reverence for the scattered papers absolute. She wasn't looking at him as a billionaire, as her boss, as a threat. She was looking at the potential ruin of something beautiful and old, and it was breaking her heart. He saw the flush of color high on her cheekbones, the slight tremble in her hands, the genuine terror in her wide, honest eyes. It was an innocence so profound, so out of place in his world of calculated motives, that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was real. She was real. The silence that followed her apology was immense, stretching into an eternity. He did not speak, did not move to help. He simply watched her on the floor, a predator observing a creature it did not yet understand. Ilara felt his gaze like a physical weight, pinning her to the marble. It was the most intense scrutiny she had ever been under, a feeling of being seen, not just on the surface, but all the way through to the frantic, frightened core of her. The air grew thick, charged with an energy she couldn't name. It was more than just fear. It was a strange, terrifying awareness. She felt dissected by his stormy grey eyes, her carefully constructed invisibility stripped away layer by layer until she was left feeling utterly, terrifyingly exposed before this powerful, silent man. Finally, he moved. With a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his rigid stillness, he knelt down, not on one knee, but crouching low to the ground, bringing his face level with hers. The space between them, once a chasm of status and power, shrank to a few intimate inches. He didn't speak to her. Instead, he reached out, his long, elegant fingers carefully picking up the illustration that had landed nearest his foot. It was a detailed rendering of a night-blooming Sirius. "Your name," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the charged air. It wasn't a question, it was a demand, spoken so quietly it was more unnerving than any shout could ever be. His gaze finally left the drawing and locked onto hers. "Tell me your name." Ilara's breath hitched. At this proximity, he was overwhelming. The clean, sharp scent of his cologne, something expensive and subtle like rain on cold stone, filled her senses. She could see the faint lines around his eyes, the only sign that this man was not carved from marble, but made of flesh and blood. As his fingers held the delicate vellum, she saw the stark contrast between his controlled masculine power and the fragile beauty of the artwork. A strange, unfamiliar current passed through her, a dizzying mix of profound fear and an even more profound, inexplicable fascination. She was a moth drawn to a flame she knew could incinerate her, mesmerized by the dangerous beauty of the man who held her fate and a piece of history so effortlessly in his hand. "Ilara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ilara Vance." He held her gaze for another long moment, his eyes searching hers for something she couldn't comprehend. Then he stood, the illustration still in his hand. "Have the others collected and brought to my office. Immediately," he commanded, his voice returning to its cool, detached authority. He turned and walked toward the private elevator without a backward glance, leaving her kneeling on the cold floor amidst the scattered relics of the past. The doors slid shut behind him, but his presence lingered. Ilara remained frozen, her heart pounding a wild, erratic rhythm against her ribs. The shame and fear were still there, but now they were mingled with something new, something thrilling and terrifying. She was no longer invisible. Mr. Thorne knew her name. The summons arrived not as a command, but as a sterile, ghost-like request in her inbox. An email from Julian Thorne's executive assistant, its subject line a bland consultation request, requested her presence in the penthouse office at 4 o'clock. The words were simple, professional, yet they sent a tremor of ice-cold dread through Ilara's veins. The incident in the lobby had been a week ago, a week of holding her breath, expecting a termination notice with every new message. This was worse. This was an invitation into the lion's den, the mythical apex of the tower she had only ever seen from the street below. She felt a primal urge to flee, to shrink back into the comforting anonymity of her subterranean archive, but she knew there was no choice. The phantom of the Foundation had beckoned, and she was compelled to answer. The elevator ride was a silent, terrifying ascent into another world. It was not one of the public cars, but a private lift accessed with a special key card provided by a stone-faced security guard. The walls were mirrored steel, reflecting 1,000 fractured images of a pale, wide-eyed girl clutching her satchel as if it were a life raft. The car didn't hum. It glided upward with an unnerving, frictionless silence, the floors ticking by on a digital display like seconds, counting down to an execution. With each floor she passed, the pressure in her ears built, a physical manifestation of the social and emotional altitude she was reaching. By the time the doors whispered open, she felt as though she had left not just the archives, but the entire known world, far, far below. His office was less a room and more a piece of the sky, captured and framed by human ambition. 3 of the 4 walls were seamless, floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, godlike panorama of Manhattan. The city sprawled below, a silent, intricate tapestry of movement and light. The space was immense, minimalist, and cold. A single massive desk of polished obsidian stood like an altar in the center, accompanied by 2 severe-looking leather chairs. There were no photographs, no personal trinkets, no sign that a human being actually inhabited this space. It was a sterile, beautiful cage, a monument to power and isolation. Ilara stood frozen on the threshold, feeling like a fragile, earthbound creature that had accidentally wandered into the stark, airless realm of a distant star. Julian Thorne was standing with his back to her, gazing out at the cityscape as if he owned every single light. He wore a dark suit impeccably tailored that made him look like a sleek, dangerous shadow against the brilliant backdrop of the setting sun. He did not turn when she entered, the sound of the elevator doors closing, behind her echoing in the vast silence. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice calm and resonant, seemingly coming from the glass itself. "Thank you for coming." He finally turned, his movements measured and deliberate. "I have recently acquired a private collection. It contains several letters purported to be from the court of Isabella d'Este. I require your expertise to verify their authenticity." The pretense was perfect, the reasoning sound, but his eyes told a different story. They weren't looking at her as an archivist. They were studying her. He gestured toward the obsidian desk, where several pieces of vellum were laid out under a soft, directed light. The contrast between the ancient, delicate documents and the severe modernity of the room was jarring. Ilara approached cautiously, her professional instincts momentarily overriding her fear. This was her world, her language. He stood beside her, his proximity a palpable force field of heat and energy. "This one, in particular," he said, pointing to a letter with a faded wax seal. "The seller claimed a direct line of provenance, but the ink composition seems inconsistent with early 16th century iron gall." It was a sharp, technical observation, a test designed to gauge her depth. Her heart hammered, but she focused on the page, her knowledge a shield against his intimidating presence. She leaned closer, her voice finding its footing as she began to explain the nuances of oxidation patterns. As she traced the path of a faded sentence with her index finger, explaining how humidity could alter the ink's appearance over centuries, her hand brushed against his. The contact was fleeting, no more than the whisper of skin against skin, but it sent a bolt of pure electricity through her entire body. It was a shocking, searing jolt of intimacy in the cold, sterile air. She snatched her hand back as if burned, a hot blush instantly flooding her cheeks. He too withdrew, his expression unreadable but for a flicker, a brief disturbance in the calm surface of his grey eyes. The silence that fell between them was no longer just the quiet of the office. It was thick, heavy, and charged with the unspoken acknowledgement of that single, accidental touch. The vast space between them had suddenly become impossibly small. He no longer seemed interested in the letters. His questions ceased, and the professional pretense dissolved, leaving a raw, unnerving silence in its wake. He simply watched her, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were trying to see past her skin, past her bones, and into the most hidden corners of her soul. Ilara felt pinned, like a butterfly under glass. She could feel the heat of his stare on her face, her neck, the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. It was a gaze of pure predatory focus, yet it was not cruel. It was something far more complex, a mixture of clinical curiosity, a deep, consuming hunger, and a flicker of something she couldn't name, something that looked almost like confusion. She had spent her life being invisible, and now under the full force of his attention, she felt terrifyingly, thrillingly real. Breaking the silence, he gestured dismissively at the love-professed letters on the desk. "All these vows of eternal devotion, this flowery prose," he murmured, his voice laced with a profound, cutting cynicism. "They are beautiful fictions, transactions wrapped in poetry. The writer wanted a commission, a title, a place at court. Love was simply the currency." The words were not directed at her, but at the ghosts of the past, yet they revealed a deep, unhealed wound within him. In that single bitter statement, Ilara glimpsed the source of his icy detachment. He wasn't a man who didn't believe in love. He was a man who had been so profoundly betrayed by the idea of it that he had declared it a bankrupt concept. A shard of his traumatic past had slipped through his armor, sharp and gleaming. A strange thing happened to Ilara then. Her fear did not vanish, but it was joined by a surprising, unwelcome surge of empathy. She saw past the billionaire, past the intimidating figure of authority, and for a fleeting second, she saw a profoundly lonely man standing in a glass cage of his own making. "Perhaps," she said, her voice quiet but steady, surprising even herself. Or perhaps the feeling was real, even if the circumstances were transactional. The human heart is not so simple. It can be desperate and sincere all at once. She looked from the ancient letters to his stormy eyes, her gaze direct and unafraid for the first time. To feel something like this, even for a moment, and to write it down so it could survive 500 years, that isn't a fiction. It's the only thing that's real. That first meeting established a new, dangerous pattern. Once, sometimes twice a week, she would be summoned to the penthouse. The reasons were always plausible: to consult on a potential auction bid for a collection of illuminated manuscripts, to organize his private library, to translate a passage from a Renaissance diary. But they both knew the work was a pretext. These encounters were a carefully orchestrated dance of proximity and retreat. They would stand shoulder to shoulder in his library, the scent of old leather and his clean, sharp cologne mingling in the air. He would ask her questions, not just about history, but about her opinions, her interpretations, her feelings about the past. He was mining her for something, seeking the authenticity he saw in her, a quality he seemed to both crave and resent. He led her into his private library one afternoon. It was a breathtaking two-story room, lined with dark wood and filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes. It should have been a warm, inviting space, but like his office, it felt more like a museum than a home. The books were pristine, their spines perfectly aligned, untouched. They were artifacts to be owned, not stories to be lived in. As Elara ran her fingers reverently over the spine of a first-edition Dante, a genuine, unbidden smile touched her lips. Julian watched her, his expression intense. He saw her pure, unadulterated love for these objects he possessed, but could not feel. He saw in her a connection to beauty that he had lost, or perhaps never had, and the sight of it seemed to deepen the chasm of his own loneliness. A treacherous feeling began to bloom in the barren soil of Elara's life. Anticipation. She started to dread the summons and, to her profound shame, to hope for it. In his presence, the crushing weight of her reality, the medical bills, her mother's illness, her profound loneliness, seemed to recede. His intense focus made her feel like the center of the universe, a stark contrast to the invisibility that defined the rest of her existence. This nascent desire filled her with a corrosive guilt. She was the dutiful daughter, the self-sacrificing caregiver. She had no right to these selfish, thrilling feelings for a man so far beyond her reach, a man who represented a world of power and indulgence she had always viewed with suspicion. Her heart was becoming a battlefield, her duty at war with a new, terrifying longing. One evening, a consultation stretched late into the night. A storm had rolled in and sheets of rain lashed against the panoramic windows. The city below became a blurred, glittering jewel. They stood together in the near darkness, the only light coming from the distant lightning and the soft glow of a desk lamp. He was silent for a long time, watching the storm. "From up here it all looks so orderly," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "Like a machine. You can see how all the parts move, how to control them." He wasn't speaking with pride, but with a kind of weary resignation. In that moment, Elara didn't see a master of the universe. She saw a king in a magnificent, empty castle, a man who could command the world but could not find a single genuine connection within it. He turned from the window, his face half-shadowed, and the mask of the ruthless billionaire was gone. In its place was a stark, unguarded vulnerability. "What do you dream of, Elara Vance?" he asked, his voice low. The question was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that it stole the air from her lungs. No one had asked her that in years. No one had thought to look past her responsibilities to see the person underneath. He wasn't making small talk. His grey eyes were fixed on hers, and she could see a genuine, desperate curiosity in their depths. He wanted to know her, the real her, the one she kept hidden even from herself. It was the most intimate question anyone had ever asked her, more intimate than any touch. A wall inside her crumbled. The performance of the capable archivist fell away, and she gave him a piece of her truth. "Florence," she whispered, the word a prayer on her lips. "I dream of studying the frescoes in the Brancacci chapel, of walking across the Ponte Vecchio at dawn. I dream of seeing the art not in books but with my own eyes, feeling the history in the stones." Her voice was thick with a longing so potent It was almost a physical ache. As she spoke, she wasn't just telling him her dream. She was reclaiming a part of herself she thought had died. He listened without interruption, his attention absolute, his gaze unwavering. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He simply listened, and in his silence, she felt more seen and understood than she had in her entire life. With each clandestine meeting, the dynamics of power began to subtly invert. She was no longer just the timid employee, terrified of his authority. Her initial fear had been tempered by a dawning understanding of the broken man behind the myth. She found herself challenging his cynical worldview, arguing for the existence of beauty and sincerity with a quiet passion that seemed to both startle and captivate him. He, in turn, began to shed his armor in her presence, letting glimpses of his wounded past show through the cracks. It became clear that he sought her out not for her expertise, but for her essence. She was his antidote to the poisonous, sycophantic world he inhabited. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, and he was losing it willingly to the one person who demanded nothing from him. Their last meeting of the week concluded, and she gathered her things to leave, the tension between them a palpable, humming wire. She turned toward the elevator, her heart a chaotic drum against her ribs. "Ilara," he said. His voice was different, low, rough, stripped of all its usual command. She stopped but did not turn around, her back still to him. She could feel his presence just behind her, the heat of his body, the energy rolling off him in waves. She waited, her entire being focused on the space between them. "Don't go," he said, the two words not a request or an order, but a raw, desperate plea. The sound of it broke through her final defenses. She knew with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty that if she turned around, if she stayed even a second longer, she would be crossing a threshold into a world of pure desire, a place from which she might never find her way back. She turned. The movement was slow, a deliberate, agonizing rotation on the axis of her life. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to retreat to the safety of her anonymity, to uphold the invisible walls she had so carefully built around her heart. But his voice, stripped of its usual armor and left raw with a plea, had been a key turning in a lock she didn't know existed. As her eyes met his across the cavernous room, she saw not the formidable billionaire, but a man drowning in the vast, empty ocean of his own life. The storm outside raged, a mirror to the tempest that had just been unleashed inside her. In that single, silent moment of decision, Ilara Vance chose to step out of the quiet story written for her and into the heart of a dangerous, unknown fire. Her transgression was not in the step she would take toward him, but in the choice to turn around at all. His face, illuminated by the distant, fractured lights of the city, was a landscape of unguarded emotion. The cynical mask was gone, the icy control shattered, leaving behind a raw vulnerability that was more intimidating than any display of power had ever been. He looked at her with a desperate hunger that was not merely physical. It was the look of a starving man seeing sustenance for the soul. The air between them thickened, vibrating with the weight of everything unsaid, every stolen glance, every accidental touch. The vast, minimalist space, designed to project power and isolation, suddenly felt suffocatingly intimate. He was the center of this universe, and for the first time, he looked utterly, terrifyingly lost within it, his gaze fixed on her as if she were his only point of navigation in a world gone dark. He moved toward her then, closing, the distance not with the predatory confidence she had come to expect, but with a hesitant, almost fragile gravity. Each step he took on the polished floor seemed to echo in the silent chamber of her heart. Ilara remained frozen, her satchel slipping from her fingers to land with a soft thud, the sound shockingly loud in the charged silence. Her mind was a maelstrom of conflicting duties and desires. She saw her mother's tired face, heard her sister's judgmental tone, pictured the photograph of his fiancée in the society pages. These images were anchors to her old reality, but the pull of the man approaching her was a tide, powerful and inexorable, threatening to tear her from all her moorings and drag her out into a deep, beautiful and terrifying sea. He stopped a breath away from her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a physical touch in itself, a current that flowed through her, awakening nerves she never knew she possessed. He lifted a hand, the movement slow, as if the air itself were thick with resistance. His fingers were trembling, a barely perceptible tremor that betrayed the monumental effort it took for him to maintain even this sliver of control. His grey eyes, no longer stormy but now the color of ash after a fire, searched her face, mapping her features as if committing them to memory. He was not looking at an employee or an object of fascination. He was looking at a person, a woman, and the sheer force of his attention made her feel more real than she had ever felt in her life. "They're all transactions," he whispered, his voice a rough, broken thing, filled with a self-loathing that stunned her. "My entire life, every deal, every conversation, my engagement. It's all a strategy, a series of calculated moves in a game I never wanted to play." He looked past her, toward the rain-streaked glass and the indifferent city lights. "And then you fell into my life. And you feel everything so honestly. Your shame, your reverence for the past, your fear, it's real. You're the only real thing in this entire empty tower." The confession was stripped of all artifice, a piece of his soul laid bare at her feet, and it was more intimate, more disarming than any physical touch could ever be. It was the sound of a man breaking. In that moment, the last vestiges of her fear were washed away by a tidal wave of empathy so powerful it stole her breath. This was not the monster from the myths, the cold-hearted phantom of Thorn Tower. This was a man in a cage, a beautiful gilded cage of his own inheritance, and he was bleeding internally from wounds no one could see. A courage she didn't know she possessed rose within her. Tentatively, she lifted her own hand, her small pale fingers coming to rest on the impossibly fine wool of his suit sleeve. The contact was electric, a small spark in the vast darkness. "I see you," she breathed, the words a truth that came from the deepest part of her. "Not the billionaire, not my boss, just you." His control snapped. With a sound that was half groan, half gasp, he closed the final inch between them. His hands came up to cradle her face, his touch not gentle, but desperate, possessive, as if he feared she might dissolve into thin air. His thumbs swept across her cheekbones, tracing the path of tears she hadn't realized were falling. He held her there, his stormy eyes boring into hers, a silent, frantic communication, passing between them. It was a question, a plea, and a surrender all at once. The world outside, with its rules and consequences, its fiancés and sick mothers, ceased to exist. There was only the rain on the glass, the frantic beating of two hearts, and the undeniable, terrifying truth that they were both standing on the edge of the same cliff, about to jump. Then his mouth was on hers. It was not a kiss of seduction, but of collision. It was a desperate, shattering impact of two profoundly lonely souls, a raw and hungry claiming that tasted of his quiet desperation and her pent-up longing. All the carefully constructed walls of her life, her shyness, her duty, her fear, were obliterated in that single, searing moment. This was the awakening, the violent, beautiful storm she had unknowingly been praying for. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against the hard lines of his body, lifting her from the ground as if she weighed nothing. He was consuming her, and she was, letting him, surrendering to a force of nature she could no longer fight, a force she no longer wanted to. The kiss deepened, becoming a frantic, wordless language. It spoke of his isolation and her solitude, of his cynicism and her secret dreams. It was a desperate attempt to bridge the unbridgeable chasm between their worlds, to find solace in the one place they were both truly equal, in their shared, aching need. Without breaking contact, he moved, carrying her through the shadows of his vast empty office. Her arms were locked around his neck, her fingers tangled in his dark hair, her body molding to his. This was no longer a choice. It was an inevitability, the final crashing crescendo of a song that had begun with a simple collision in a lobby. He was carrying her away from everything she had ever known, and toward a future that was both a terrifying abyss and a beautiful, forbidden promise. He laid her down on the cool, crisp linens of his bed, in a room walled by the glittering city skyline. The storm had passed, leaving the night air washed clean and the city lights poured in, painting their bodies in silver and shadow. This was the ultimate transgression, the final, irrevocable act. Her virginity, the quiet symbol of her deferred life and untouched heart, was no longer a burden or a vow, but a conscious, trembling offering. As he came down over her, his eyes reflecting the 1,000 distant lights of the world they were shutting out, Ilara knew this was more than a physical act. It was the shattering of one life and the beginning of another. It was a surrender not just of her body, but of her soul, a complete and terrifying immersion into the beautiful, broken world of Julian Thorne. The first light of dawn was a cruel, clinical blade, slicing through the panoramic windows and exposing the sterile perfection of Julian's bedroom. Ilara awoke to an overwhelming silence, a void where the storm of the previous night had been. The sheets beside her were cool, the indentation of his body already gone. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone in the vast, empty expanse of his bed, a single, misplaced object in a room designed for one. The passionate, desperate connection they had shared now seemed like a fever dream, and the morning light was the cold, sobering reality. Her body, a landscape of new and tender aches, was the only proof that any of it had been real. The profound solitude that descended upon her was heavier and more painful than any she had ever known before, a loneliness born not of absence but of a presence recently and brutally withdrawn. She slipped out of the bed, the silk of his robe a foreign, mocking caress against her skin. The penthouse, which had felt like a forbidden sanctuary in the dark, was now a cold, intimidating gallery of wealth. Every polished surface reflected a pale, haunted version of herself, an intruder in a world she had only been allowed to visit. The intimacy they had shared had evaporated with the dawn, leaving behind only the stark, unbridgeable chasm between their lives. She walked through the silent, cavernous space, her bare feet whispering on the cold marble, feeling like a ghost haunting the scene of a life she could never have. The night had been a collision, an emotional cataclysm, but the morning was a quiet, devastating reminder that she was, and always would be, an outsider looking in on his meticulously constructed universe. On the obsidian altar of his desk, a newspaper lay folded to the society section. The photograph was a punch to her gut. Julian smiling a cool, practiced smile, his hand resting on the arm of a woman so polished and perfect she seemed sculpted from ice. The headline announced the formal celebration of their engagement, a union of the Thorne and Van Doren dynasties. It spoke of legacy, power, and a shared future. Reading the clinical prose, Ilara felt the last vestiges of the night's magic turn to ash in her mouth. She was the secret, the sordid footnote to this grand public narrative. He had come to her for a moment of authenticity, a brief escape from this gilded cage. But this woman, this alliance, this public life, was his reality. She was not a chapter in his story. She had merely been a line, hastily written and easily erased. The unspoken contract of their relationship was now laid bare in the stark light of day, written in the ink of the society pages. His desperation for something real had met her desperation for a solution, and their night together had been the inevitable, tragic result. It was a transaction of the soul. He had purchased a piece of her innocence, her untouched heart, and in return he would save her mother. The thought was a shard of ice, piercing the fragile, nascent hope that had begun to bloom within her. Had the raw vulnerability he'd shown her been real, or was it simply the most effective currency to purchase what he desired? The ambiguity was a form of torture, cheapening the most profound experience of her life, and recasting her surrender not as a moment of connection, but as a simple, devastating sale. A wave of shame, so profound it made her physically nauseous, washed over her. She saw herself through her mother's eyes, through her sister's, and felt a deep, cutting self-loathing. She had betrayed every quiet value she had ever held, sacrificing her dream of a pure, transcendent love for a night of desperate passion with a man who belonged to another. The need to escape, to erase her presence from this place, became a frantic, primal urge. She found her simple clothes, which looked impossibly plain and naive in this cathedral of wealth, and dressed with trembling hands. She could not bear the thought of him returning, of seeing the cool, controlled mask slip back into place. She had to leave before he could dismiss her, before he could make her feel like a mess he now had to clean up. In his office, Julian had not slept. He had watched the storm pass and the city awaken, the raw, unfiltered emotion of their encounter, leaving him feeling flayed open and terrified. He had retreated to this familiar space of control, intending to compose himself before facing her again in the light of day. But as the sun rose, a profound and unfamiliar dread began to creep into his veins. The silence from the bedroom was too absolute. He walked back, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The bed was empty. The scent of her was a ghost in the air. Then he saw the newspaper on his desk, exactly where he had left it, a careless, cruel landmine. A wave of self-disgust washed over him. In his cowardice, he had fled from her warmth, and in doing so, he had allowed the cold, hard facts of his life to chase her away. The journey back to her own life was a slow, agonizing descent. The silent, mirrored elevator dropped her from the sky, depositing her into a world that now seemed impossibly loud and grey. On the subway, pressed amongst the anonymous mourning crowd, she felt a new kind of invisibility. Before she had felt unseen, now she felt like a fraud, a woman carrying a secret so immense it should have been visible on her skin. Every glance from a stranger felt like an accusation. She was no longer the quiet, dutiful archivist. She was a woman who had spent the night in a billionaire's penthouse, a woman who had sold a piece of her soul. The city, which had once felt merely indifferent, now felt actively hostile, its roaring energy a judgment on the silent, cataclysmic changes that had occurred within her. Back in her small apartment, the four walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with the scent of her old, naive life. The second-hand furniture, the view of the brick wall. It was all a monument to the girl she had been, a girl who was now gone forever. She stripped off her clothes as if they were contaminated and stood under a stream of scalding water, scrubbing her skin raw. She wanted to wash away his scent, the memory of his hands, the ghost of his touch that still lingered on her body. But the change was not on her skin. It was etched into her soul. The silence of her apartment was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of his voice, the memory of his desperate kiss, and the brutal, undeniable truth of his other life, a life in which she had no place. A week passed in a haze of silent, aching misery. There was no call, no email, no sign that she had ever existed in his world. The only communication was a sterile automated email from the Thorn Foundation's payroll department. Her salary had been deposited, but alongside it was a notification of a new, separate account established in her mother's name, funded with a sum so large it made her dizzy. It was the payment, the cold, impersonal finality of the transaction. It was his way of saying their business was concluded. A deep, wrenching grief tore through her, but as the tears subsided, something new and unfamiliar flickered to life in the ashes of her heart. Anger, a defiant spark. She was not a victim. She had made a choice, and the connection she had felt, the raw truth they had shared, had been real, no matter how he chose to frame it now. They were both back in their respective cages, separated by a chasm of wealth and circumstance. Julian was imprisoned in his glass tower, the silence of his penthouse now a deafening roar, haunted by the memory of the one authentic thing he had ever touched, only to lose it through his own fear. His immense power felt like a curse, reinforcing his profound isolation. Ilara, in her small room, was still trapped by her responsibilities, but the walls of her prison had changed. She had seen the world from his vantage point, had felt the terrifying, beautiful force of a real human connection. The night that had shattered her illusions had also shattered her passivity. It was a transgression that had broken her, yes, but it had also set her free from the quiet, timid girl she used to be, awakening a strength she never knew she possessed. 3 months passed, a season turning in the city and in her soul. The money, a cold and impersonal fact, had worked its quiet miracle. Her mother's voice on the phone grew stronger each week, the forced cheerfulness replaced by a genuine, fragile hope. The crushing weight that had defined Ilara's existence had lifted, leaving behind a strange, light-headed emptiness. She was no longer a creature of pure necessity. She was free, and the freedom was terrifying. She began the long, slow process of excavating the woman she had buried beneath years of duty. She spent hours in the public library, her fingers tracing the maps of Florence, her heart relearning the language of its own desires. She was still a quiet person, but her silence was no longer born of fear. It was a stillness of self-possession, the calm of a survivor who had walked through fire and was now learning to live with the light. A package arrived on a Tuesday morning, its presence on her worn doormat an anomaly. It was a flat, elegant portfolio, wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address, delivered by a courier who vanished before she could ask any questions. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a familiar, frantic rhythm she had almost forgotten. With trembling hands she unwrapped it. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single sheet of vellum. It was the 16th century botanical illustration of the night-blooming Cereus, the very one he had rescued from the marble floor, the first piece of history they had ever shared. It was a flower that bloomed only once, for a few precious hours in the deepest dark, a breathtaking, fleeting miracle, a perfect, painful metaphor for the single night that had irrevocably altered the course of two lives. She did not cry. Instead, a profound and quiet understanding settled over her. This was not a gift of possession, not another transaction. It was a message, a confession sent across the chasm of their separate worlds. It was his way of saying that what had happened between them, however brief and impossible, was real. It was beautiful. It was worth preserving. Tucked into the corner of the portfolio was a small, thick card, embossed with the Thorne family crest. On it, in his sharp, decisive handwriting, were 3 words that undid her completely. Not an apology, not a plea, but a benediction. For your Florence. It was not an invitation back into his world. It was a key to her own. He was giving her back the dream she had confessed to him in the dark, setting her free not just from her debts, but from him. High above the city, in the silent, glass-walled penthouse, Julian Thorne stood before the empty space on his library wall where the illustration had once hung. He had broken his engagement weeks ago, the dissolution of the powerful alliance sending quiet shockwaves through their world. The official reason was a sterile, mutual disagreement, but he knew the truth. He could no longer live a life of calculated transactions. Ilara had been a mirror, showing him the profound emptiness of his existence, and he could no longer unsee it. He had sent her the drawing as an act of penance and of hope, a hope not for himself, but for her. He had to let her go, to truly set her free, so that she could find the beauty in the world that he had only ever been able to see reflected in her eyes. His tower was no longer a fortress of power. It was a monastery of solitude, where he was slowly, painfully learning to feel again. Ilara carefully placed the illustration on the small wall above her desk. It was the first and only piece of real art she had ever owned, a 500-year-old testament to beauty, survival, and a single impossible night. She looked from its delicate, ink-drawn petals to the fellowship application on her laptop screen, the cursor blinking patiently. The fear was gone, replaced by a clear, certain resolve. The dream of Florence was no longer a painful reminder of a life she couldn't have. It was a destination, a tangible future waiting for her. She would go. She would walk the same streets as the masters she so admired, and she would do it not as an escape, but as a deliberate act of becoming. She was the author of her own story now, and this was the first sentence of a new, unwritten chapter, a story she would live for herself. Their two souls, once collided, now moved in separate orbits, forever altered by the gravitational pull of their brief encounter. He, in his silent kingdom in the sky, was beginning a long journey out of the darkness, his heart slowly relearning how to beat in time with the world. She, on the streets below, was preparing for a journey toward the light, her spirit finally unbound. Whether their paths were destined to cross again on a sun-drenched piazza in Florence, or only in the quiet archives of memory, the future remained an unwritten page. But the connection had been real, a single perfect bloom in the dark, and for both of them, it had been enough to change everything. If you believe their story deserves another chapter and want to follow more journeys of the heart, I invite you to subscribe, share, and comment on what you hope tomorrow holds for them.